housing provider in New Zealand.
Call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. This bill is an utterly misconceived and completely inadequate response to the intensifying New Zealand housing crisis, a crisis that government sat around watching develop for 5 long years, a crisis in which rents in the main centres, especially Auckland and Christchurch, have rocketed. Yet the government's priorities are saving money and reducing the size of state services, rather than ensuring that the needs of people, especially those at the lower end of the socio-economic spectrum, are adequately met. New Zealand First is committed to the provision of a genuine social housing service by the government as a fundamental responsibility to ensure that people unable to buy a home or for whom home ownership is not appropriate are able to get one to rent, to have fair rental related to their income and have stability in their lives. The social housing deficit in New Zealand is now huge. More and more Kiwis are unable to afford a home. Many will never be able to buy one. Their need is for more options for long-term rental housing, which in this country only the state and perhaps local government can reliably provide for low-income people and on the scale needed. The government's social housing policy reduces the scope of the operation of Housing New Zealand. It will transfer large sums of money to community housing organisations through subsidies and registered providers. But there are many unanswered questions which I've asked again in this House about some of these providers. What about their competency in managing not just the housing but the people who need them? Can they be relied upon in the long term? Who will they really be in the long term? They will likely become a nightmare to monitor and require significant resources to do so. The bill provides for annual reports, but there is very little detail about what those would contain. The bill also provides for intervention powers in the case of a range of possible specified failures, but they would highly likely also be difficult to administer. The bill also provides for the state agency to give instructions and to appoint an administrator. So why transfer the housing responsibility to such organisations in the first place? None of this gives any real confidence that so much public money should be used in this way. The state is the best provider where taxpayers' money is concerned. These community organisations will own the housing funded or gifted by the government. How do we know the money will be well spent or the housing assets applied for the objectives of social housing? There will be no state asset in return. Money out, nothing back. What happens really if a recipient organisation fails? Where do the assets go then? Will the agency be able to cope with such a failure? Will the government be able to cope for that matter? How transparent and accountable are the processes for allocating funds to community providers? What safeguards and what risk management have been put in place? I haven't seen any evidence of that at all. Will they have enough competence in the housing market when so many private providers have failed? These are just a few of the questions left unanswered by this bill. And, Mr Chairman, local government should be considered. I agree with Annette King on this. Local government is, in many cases, well able to do this. They have their own policies well matched to local needs, and they should be included. But this government hates local government. That's at the root of why they won't consider that. It's as simple as that, in my view. Although there are some good community providers for social housing, such as the Salvation Army, Habitat for Humanity, there will be many to which the social housing need should not be sent. The risks of that are far too high. There's a risk to the government's financial outcomes, and there is a risk to the community's social outcomes, and there are risks for New Zealand's most vulnerable people, and there are risks to low-income families from these policies. The risks overall versus the benefits are far far too high. Mr Chairman, this bill is fundamentally flawed and should not pass.
I'm going to call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to talk on